Thank you all for joining us today for the Simplex BI webinar called Workflows, Everything You Wanted to Know, but were afraid to ask. Admittedly, it's a bit of false advertising because I'm certain I can't tell you everything you want to know about workflows in the course of this webinar. But we certainly are going to try to share a lot of our information, hopefully have some questions throughout. We do have a pretty sizable group here today, so if you could submit questions via chat to Ivan, where it says questions and comments, Ivan, if you could submit that to him, that would be great. He'll collect the questions as we go through, and we'll try to get everything answered for you. So before we get started, just a little bit about Simplex BI. My name is Roger Cottrell, and I'm joined with my partner, Ivan Stokotelny. I've been working with large law firm financial systems for over 25 years now. Ivan's a little younger. He's probably been working with law firms for about 15 years. I was previously Director of Professional Services at Aderant, and have now been consulting on my own for about 6 years. So Ivan and I formed Simplex BI a couple of years ago as just a new alternative for Aderant clients to get consulting services and reporting and business intelligence assistance with their Aderant systems. So through my years with Aderant and now as an independent consultant, I have helped firms implement a lot of workflows. And I know we have a range of firms in terms of size and also longevity on Aderant. But when I first got involved with Aderant workflows, probably in 2013, 2014, quite honestly, it was a bit of a mess. And some of you may have experienced that. When I was working on the Aderant side, it was very difficult to get these implemented. Over the past few years, I've seen significant changes in the workflow platform, and I would encourage any of you who have not, dipped your toes into the workflow waters to really consider it now. I think it's a very stable platform, and I think Aderant has done a lot to shore up that system and start to incorporate these workflows into the services framework properly. So we'll start off just talking about why would you want to implement a workflow. First off, and probably the most obvious, is that it eliminates duplicate entry. So if we're talking about, say, a file opening workflow, you have probably secretaries out there who are filling out either a paper form, possibly, or more likely today, you have some type of electronic form that's built in Microsoft Word. They enter all of that information, and it gets passed around the firm through various email lists and such, and ultimately arrives somewhere in accounting, and it has to be entered into Aderant. So, let's get rid of that duplicate entry. The really important thing about workflow is that by designing these processes electronically, it helps to enforce your firm's policies, in that each step of the way during the workflow process, you are causing this transaction to move through and get the approvals that are required for your firm. It also provides greater visibility into where is this transaction. The attorney comes to you and says, hey, we submitted this new, this new matter request 3 days ago. Where is it? Well, you can go into the workflow and find exactly whose kind of virtual desktop it's on, and report back and try to move that process along. It also creates an audit trail. So if you need to look back and see who approved a transaction, and which approvals it went through, you can go back and look at that audit trail. It's also ideal for remote or hybrid offices. I know many of you probably still are not back working full time in your offices. And I can't tell you how many Aderant clients have told me that they wish they had more workflow processes when the pandemic and the shutdown hit. I think especially around the billing process, a lot of firms were really stuck on how are they going to get their bills out and deal with all of the edits and such when they were still in a very manual process. So if we take a look at the workflows that are available in Aderant, as you may be aware, the product actually comes with several workflow templates. Okay? These templates are meant to be functioning workflows that will not meet your needs. Okay? Just by definition, it's really impossible to create kind of a standard workflow that is going to meet the internal needs and processes of so many law firms. But these are working templates and a great place to start. So some of them include the new timekeeper workflow, file opening, which is probably the most common workflow that is implemented and something most firms are interested in. For those of you that do have Aderant's expense management system, workflow is built into that system. And then paperless pre-bill or paperless billing. This is a big one and probably the second most implemented workflow that I've seen after file opening. And then accounts payable, another really critical workflow that I see firms implementing and highly recommend that you implement. As you think about the accounts payable process, there's just hundreds and thousands of transactions flying all over the place in terms of invoices that need to get paid and check requests and filing fees that are coming in. So accounts payable is a great workflow to implement. You can also implement a write-off request as part of the collections module. And then for those of you that use the MatterWorks product, there are some workflows built in there. I personally have not worked with any of the MatterWorks workflows. So let's talk briefly about the keys to a successful implementation. And in my experience, one of the most difficult parts of implementing workflow is to define the process, right? So if you have manual processes today, things can go in various directions, even if you have a procedure. And sometimes the process that you think is going on is not always the process that's going on, in reality out in the firm. So it's really critical that before you get into any type of custom programming and defining what the workflow is going to do is that you understand the process and the various steps that you need to take throughout. I also encourage you to validate that process with users. I mostly work with people in law firm accounting departments. I kind of consider myself one of them, one of you, and we tend to have our own view of what's going on out there. But it's really important that you go out and validate the actual process. A good example of this is if you are implementing paperless pre-bill, right? You may think, oh, well, the pre-bill goes to the secretary he or she gives it to the attorney, and then it comes back to the accounting department. What you don't know about are the 6 steps that happen in between, where the secretary copies this pre-bill, puts it on some other attorney's desk, who then sends it over to somewhere else. So again, just make sure you validate the process. You don't want to go through a workflow implementation and the time and cost of doing that, only to find out that you really missed the mark and your workflow doesn't meet the need of the users. I also encourage you to get the standard workflow template that you are looking to implement, or at least that subject matter. Have that installed at your firm in your test system, and get into it and figure out how it works. If you have not used workflow before, it's imperative that you understand the basics of Aderant workflows. Doing this will really prevent a lot of mistakes that you are going to make during the implementation process. Because if you don't know how it works, you can't anticipate how the users are going to interact with it. The other thing I like about the standard workflows is that there are various integrations within those workflows that have been tested and are known to work. So even if the standard file opening process, which is very simple, okay, even if it doesn't meet your needs, you really should look to start with that template and take advantage of the integrations and various processes that Aderant has built into it. And then lastly, as you're going through one of these implementations, you have to plan on exhaustive testing and data validation. Okay? Depending on the complexity of your workflow, there are many different paths a transaction can take. Okay? And all of that data ultimately needs to reside in the standard Aderant tables. Okay? So it's critical that you test the process that's been developed and validate that all of the data that's coming in from the form or the workflow process is populating the appropriate tables in Aderant. I really can't stress that enough. Okay? And unfortunately, every time you go through an upgrade or make a change to the workflow, you're going to need to go through this testing process again. Okay? So today we are going to focus on, we're going to have a discussion on kind of the 3 most popular workflows that I see. So we're going to get into a little bit of detail on these, on how they work. The processes that I'm going to show you are very simple, okay? But you have the ability to customize all of these processes to meet your firm's needs. Okay? So let's first talk about file opening and what the typical file opening workflow looks like. So when the user goes into Aderant and starts the file opening workflow, they are typically taken into a data entry task. Okay? The data entry task is where they're going to enter client information if it's a new client, the matter information. Obviously, if you have a new client, you're going to be opening up the first matter for that client. And they will enter all of the related party information that they have in order to run a conflicts check. Now, one thing I should mention, for those of you that are on Aderant version 8.2.2 or looking to move to it, okay, you can now launch your workflows directly from EA Pro. Okay, and users can act on all of the approvals directly from EA Pro. So, I think that's a big step forward from having to use expert assistant. So in this data entry task, as I said, the user, typically a secretary or legal admin, whatever they're called at your firm, will be entering this data. Okay? When they submit this workflow form, in most cases, it is going to go to the conflicts department. Now, I recognize your firm may have a different process. Perhaps after the data entry task, it actually needs to go to the billing attorney to be reviewed to make sure for correctness before it goes to conflicts. Okay? But I'm trying to keep this simple just for demonstration purposes. So in the names reconciliation and conflicts check phase or task, okay, your conflicts department will receive the workflow. Okay? They will be able to review all of the new client and matter information that's been entered in on that form. And assuming there are related parties, you can have a button on the screen right in the workflow that will actually run the conflicts check and bring the hits back into your workflow form. You can then print or generate your conflicts report in a PDF format and attach that to the workflow. Once the conflicts team has done their piece, in my example here, the workflow is moving on to the risk management committee. Sometimes it's the ethics committee, or in your case, it's, you know, maybe this just goes back to the attorney. Okay? Maybe the attorney needs to review the conflicts report before it goes to any kind of ethics committee for review. Okay? So in this case, the workflow has gone to the risk management committee. And the question is it going to be approved? Well, if they approve it, okay, then the client and matter get opened in Aderant. Okay? If they do not approve it, okay, there are a couple things that could happen here. One is the process may just end. There's a conflict. We can't take on this work. We're going to end this process. Okay? Or perhaps it then gets returned to the billing attorney. Perhaps there's a waiver required. So it could go back to the billing attorney saying this matter cannot be approved until we receive a waiver. Okay? So that would be another step that you would add into the workflow. Okay? So you can go all different directions here, but the end result, okay, if everything goes right, is you have a new client, a new matter in the system. Okay, they are open, ready for time entry, ready to be billed, and all of those related parties that were entered on the form and run through the conflicts check have now been automatically linked to the new matter. Okay? So this is where we've really saved a lot of time, a lot of duplicate entry, okay? And we've been able to monitor the progress of the workflow throughout. Okay? Now, there are a few things that you want to think about as you're going through this file opening process. Okay? Every firm is a little bit different on how they handle this. Okay? My workflow here shows that the matter is getting opened after it's approved by the ethics committee. Well, you can actually create a pending matter earlier on in this process. So I have one client where their business process is that everything gets created as a pending matter, and they have a daily report that goes out to all of the attorneys to show them all pending matters. And it's incumbent upon those attorneys to review those pending matters for any potential conflicts. So what we do at that firm is when this names reconciliation and conflicts check stage is completed, the workflow does a pending save to the client and matter tables. So at the point that I complete this workflow step, if I were to go into Entity Manager, I would see a pending client and a pending matter. Alternatively, you might not want to do that until your ethics committee has approved it. This is a configuration choice that you need to think about and make during your implementation of the file opening workflow. Another step that you can include in your workflow process is an AR or WIP review. So perhaps after somewhere in here, after risk management has approved it, it may go to the collections manager if, for example, if the client has AR that's over 60 days old, it might be your policy that it requires an AR approval in order for that matter to be opened. So if that criteria exists in the system, it could go to your collections manager or someone else who manages AR and WIP in the firm. And you can actually have an AR aging display right in the workflow. So that collections manager would open up the workflow, would be able to look at the aging and determine what the next steps are. Now, assuming it's approved, then it can move on in the process, which might, the final step might be to open the matter. Another new feature, and some of you I know already have file opening implemented, but one of the complaints that I heard for many years was that firms wanted to be able to print the content of that file opening form. Now, for any of you that have file opening today, you know there's no print button, okay? So if a secretary wants a report of the information that was entered in there, you're pretty much taking screenshots. So they have, Aderant has now added the ability for an SSRS report to be generated at some point in the file opening workflow. So again, back at this firm that I've been working with recently, after we complete the conflicts check, we create the pending client and the pending matter, but the system also generates an SSRS report that is available in a folder, a network folder, and it contains all of the information that was entered on that file opening form. So some of you that have existing file opening processes, this may not be built in there. You may want to talk to Aderant to see if you can get it included. Another big item is document management integration. Now, I will say this tends to increase the scope and cost of a file opening workflow implementation. But one of the challenges here is that as you go through the file opening process, you are collecting various documents. So you've got the conflicts check attached to the workflow. Okay? You might have a waiver or an engagement letter that gets attached to the workflow. And the question is, well, once that workflow is done, where the heck did those documents go? Now, it is possible to save them into expert image and have them attached to the client and matter, but there's no, attorneys aren't going to go look in expert image to find the waiver letter that was sent out and signed by the client. So if you build in integration with your document management system, iManage, for example, you can have all the documents that were collected in this process saved directly to your DMS. Typically requires licensing the API from your document management system provider, but it's certainly a very useful integration to have.
Roger, we had a few questions come in while you were talking on the slide. First one was, what conflicts process are you referencing that will be used on the file opening workflow button?
So just using Aderant conflicts within the workflow form, it is going to go out and actually run the conflicts check for the based on the parties that have been entered, the related parties that have been entered into the form by the person that completed this data entry task. So you can do two things in this names reconciliation. First off, it's going to check for duplicate names. So if Roger Cottrell was entered as a related party, we don't want to enter a second version of my name in the system, because then we're creating duplicates. So it would identify that Roger already exists in the system and not create a new name. And then it would pass my name over to Aderant's conflict system, run the conflicts check, and bring back the hits. Hopefully that answers the question.
And the second question was in reference to the ESSRS report.
Yeah.
Is it available in 8.2.1 or only 8.2.2?
Not sure. That might be something that you go back to Aderant on. The first I've seen it is in 8.2.2. I don't know if they included it in the 8.2.1 standard process. Now, I will say there is a configuration setting in Configuration Manager where you can direct the output of that SSRS report. So what I will do later today is I will go into the 8.2.2 Configuration Manager and remind myself where that setting is. And I suspect if you go into Configuration Manager in 8.2.1, if that same setting exists, then I would suspect that the report is available. Okay. If that doesn't exist in Configuration Manager in 8.2.1, it's probably not available. Okay. All right. We happy to stay on as long as we need towards the end of this to take more questions as well. So next we're going to talk about paperless pre-bill. Honestly, one of my favorites. It has taken years to really get this right. And paperless pre-bill is probably one of the most impactful things that I've seen firms implement in terms of, you know, optimizing a previously very manual process. Okay. Now, you also have to be aware that there's a major change management issue here. And if you implement paperless pre-bill, you will incur resistance, okay? And you know who you're going to get the resistance from, okay? But I've seen firms go through this. There was complaining from the attorneys, but they got there. And when the pandemic hit, I don't know what they would have done without it. So the way paperless pre-bill works, if you're not familiar, is the first thing you do is you generate your pre-bills at the beginning of the month as you would normally. Okay? Once those pre-bills are generated, you do something called launch markups. Okay? So you may, if you're not using paperless pre-bill, you may have seen the security setting and turned this off so it wasn't in your ribbon. But launch markup essentially means start the workflow. Okay? So it's going to go through, look at your workflow process, and based on the process you've designed, it's going to send the electronic version of the pre-bill to the appropriate person. Now, there's all kinds of things you can do here. Okay? I work with one firm where they have 9 different paperless pre-bill workflows. Okay? So we're going to keep it simple here. That pre-bill might go directly to the billing attorney. I've seen firms where the billing attorney, very detail oriented, he or she really wants control over all aspects of their billing. They don't involve their legal admin. They just want to get the pre-bills. So we can send the pre-bill over to the billing attorney. When they open up that pre-bill, it looks a lot like the expert billing desktop, right? So they have a lot of the same functions that your billers have. Not all of them, okay? But they can edit the amounts, they can edit narratives, they can apply credits, they can apply trust, they can change the amounts of individual time entries, etc. Now, more likely than not, when you send out the pre-bills, you probably are going to have them go to the legal admin first. Okay? What I see happen in most firms is the pre-bill goes to the legal admin secretary, and he or she will do kind of all of the initial edits. Okay? Mostly the narrative edits, fixing mistakes, making sure there's consistency, making sure task and activity codes are correct. Okay? Depending on the strength of the legal admin, they might be able to do some financial edits to it. Again, depending on what the attorneys empower them to do. Once the legal admin does their edits, again, in most cases, it would then go to the billing attorney. Okay? We figure at some point the billing attorney needs to look at the pre-bill. Okay? Now, after all these edits are done and write-downs are completed, you may have a policy regarding write-down approvals. Okay? So this is totally configurable for your firm. Perhaps your firm says any write-down greater than or equal to $5,000 requires approval. Okay? So after the billing attorney completes it, it would actually go to this write-down approval task, okay? And someone would have to approve it. Now, that may be the manager of billing and collections, okay? Or it may be a finance committee, etc. You could also have different levels of write-downs. So perhaps if it's between 5,000 and 20,000, the billing manager can approve it. But if it's over 20,000, perhaps it needs to go to the CFO or a managing partner. So you can escalate these approvals. So if an approval is not needed because it didn't meet the threshold criteria, this pre-bill is going to come back to the billing coordinator. Okay? If it did need approval, it's going to go down to the write-down approval stage, and then ultimately it will wind up back with the billing coordinator. Now, the job of the billing coordinator is to accept the various changes that have occurred in this workflow. Okay? So the pre-bill workflow is in many senses a temporary document. You can almost think of it as your paper pre-bill that has all of the edits in it. Okay? So all of this information resides in the workflow, but it has not been committed to the database yet. Okay? So it's the billing coordinator's job to go through and look at the changes and the edits that were made and approve them so that they then get committed to the system. Okay. Now, there are some configurations allowed here so that the billing coordinator doesn't have to approve all changes. For example, if the secretary and the attorney made narrative edits, do you really need the billing coordinator to approve those? So you can configure the system to say, look, ignore narrative edits. I, as the billing coordinator, doesn't need to look at those. Okay. Once the billing coordinator accepts all of the changes, they're all committed to the database and the workflow has terminated. Okay. So now we're just back to a pre-bill that's in the billing desktop that the billing coordinator would then finish processing that bill, prepare the bill, generate the physical DocuDraft output or the electronic bill. Now, there are some things to consider throughout this pre-bill process. One is, after you generate the pre-bills, if you choose, you can prepare the pre-bills. So I suspect most of you today, after you generate your pre-bills, you prepare the pre-bills, okay? Which, by the way, in more recent versions, you can set the system to automatically prepare the pre-bills at the time of generation. Okay? For those of you who may not be familiar, this is the process of sending the pre-bill through DocuDraft to create the physical document. So if you do create, or if you do prepare the pre-bills, when you launch your markups, the actual a PDF of the pre-bill will be attached to the workflow. Okay? So this is kind of a nice transitional step for your attorneys, because what they're going to, they're going to complain that they like to have the paper. They're going to complain that they like the old format of the pre-bill. So if you prepare the pre-bill and attach it, they can at least look at it, and if they need to print it, they can print it. Okay. Now, one overall challenge with workflows is that you create this system and you're kind of confined to the rules that you've built. Okay. However, throughout Aderant, you do have the ability to assign a task. So if a pre-bill comes to me as the billing attorney and I say, you know what, I didn't work on this month. Ivan did all of the work. I really want Ivan to review the pre-bill. Instead of sending the pre-bill to him, the printed pre-bill through interoffice mail, I can go into the workflow and I can assign that workflow to Ivan, and he now owns it. Okay, it's his job to review it, make his edits, and send it along. Okay. One of the more challenging issues with the pre-bill workflow are transfers. Okay? So the system allows you to do transfers. However, as I said before, none of the changes that occur during this paperless pre-bill process have been committed to the database until the billing coordinator accepts them. So if the attorney is reviewing matter 1 and matter 2, and they are single bills as opposed to consolidated, and there's an entry on matter 1 that should be on matter 2, in the attorney's mind, they're going to click transfer on the pre-bill 1. They're going to save it and close it. They're going to open up pre-bill 2, and they're going to see the time entry that they just transferred. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. Okay? So that's something they have to get used to, that actual transfer will not show up until billing has accepted it. Now, consolidated transfers are a little bit different because you're transferring, if you're transferring from one matter to another matter within a consolidated bill, well, it's all in the same pre-bill. So it actually will move it between matters on a consolidated bill. Another helpful hint here is when you go through this paperless pre-bill process, you're going to end up with one or two different, maybe 9 different workflows to meet the needs of the way your process flows. One thing that I've repeatedly asked, had to have Aderant do, is create a workflow that goes directly to the billing coordinator. Okay? Now, why did I do this? So what happens is, let's say you've gone through the workflow process, and the pre-bill gets back to the billing coordinator. Billing coordinator accepts all the changes, and then the attorney calls and says, or the secretary calls and says, hey, the attorney asked me to make a few more changes on this bill. Can you send the pre-bill back to me? Well, I can do that. I can launch a new workflow, and it's going to go to the legal admin. It's going to go back to the billing attorney and go through the whole process. Okay? However, you may not want it to go through the whole process. You might have 4 or 5 steps in this process. So if you create a workflow that just goes to the billing coordinator, they can launch that workflow, and the workflow will be assigned to them. And then they can just assign it over to that secretary or over to that attorney. And when that person's done, it will come right back to billing. So it's a little trick to get something into workflow, but be able to bypass all of the rules that you set for your various workflows. Any questions on paperless pre-bill, Ivan, before I move on?
Nope.
Okay. How are we doing on time? Okay. The next one I'm going to talk about is accounts payable workflow. Accounts payable workflow is significantly improved in 8.2.2. Some of these improvements may also be in recent patches of 8.2.1. I'm not sure. So AP workflow is another critical process that I like to see implemented at firms. And the reason for that is that, one, it's, there are so many transactions for accounting to keep track of. There are also a lot of different approval rules throughout firms, and the AP workflow can really automate that process. So if you have not moved to Expert AP yet, I do recommend that you look at doing that. It's really not that big a change. It's very similar to Classic. It just looks different. The processes are the same. And the new workflow, AP workflow, it's built into the framework as part of the system. So the first step is you launch the workflow, and this can be configured in a couple of different ways, but my experience is whoever is requesting the payment to be made knows why they're doing it. They know who needs to be paid. They know the amount of the check that needs to be cut, and they know the client matter or the general ledger code that it needs to be charged to. Okay. So AP workflow can work in a centralized AP configuration or in a decentralized world. So if invoices primarily come into accounts payable, you might have your accounts payable staff code these invoices and then send them out via workflow for approval. On the other side of things, you may have invoices that are coming into attorneys and to paralegals, and certainly you have secretaries and paralegals who are requesting filing fees and such. So they can enter the information and have it come into accounts payable. So it's very flexible that way. So after the invoice is created and coded, you can attach an image of the actual invoice that needs to be paid. And then the question is an approval required? Okay. So perhaps client billable charges under $250 don't require approval. right? So they would just bypass the approval. But more often than not, some type of approval will be required. Okay? Now, depending on how the offsets on the invoice, depending on how it was coded, okay, it may require a general ledger approval, or it may require disbursement approval, or it might require both. Now, one of the features that Aderant has built in, which was always a challenge in previous versions of the workflow, is that if I have an invoice, and let's say it's $1,500, $1,000 was charged to the GL, and $500 was charged to a billable matter. Okay, the GL approval needs to go to Ivan, and the disbursement approval needs to go to John. Okay, so what happens is the system will actually send out two tasks simultaneously. Okay, so Ivan's going to get an approval, and when he opens it up, it's going to say, hey, there's a $1,500 invoice out here, and you are responsible for approving this $1,000 general ledger item that was charged to an account for which you are responsible. At the same time, John perhaps is the billing attorney. John's receiving an approval that says, hey, there's a $1,500 invoice out here, and I need you to approve this $500 that was charged to your client. And it's going to give them all the details, and they will be able to access any attachments to make sure it's a valid entry. Now, that workflow will not proceed to the next step until both of these approvals have been completed. So once those approvals are completed, the workflow will go to AP approval. I like every single workflow to go through AP approval. You may have to tweak the Aderant configuration a bit to make this happen, but I think the AP should see every invoice before it actually gets created in the system. Okay. So typically you would have a work group in Aderant that might be 2 or 3 people in the AP department who are going through and processing all of these workflows, which ultimately creates the invoice in Aderant. So if no workflow approval was required, in my example, is a client disbursement less than $250, doesn't require approval, I still want it to go through this AP approval phase or stage. Once it completes AP approval, it can come into the system as a posted invoice. Now, it doesn't have to automatically post. You can still go in and review this and post it in accounts payable. But if it's already gone through this AP approval phase, then at that point, why not just have it come in as a posted invoice into accounts payable? So some other configurations to consider. I only showed one level of GL approval here, but you can have multiple levels. So similar to the example I gave on file opening, perhaps there is a assistant director of IT, and the assistant director of IT is allowed to approve invoices up to $10,000. Okay. If it's above $10,000, it may require that person's approval and have to go to, say, the CIO for approval. So you can have multiple levels of approval on both the GL and disbursement, and you can actually do an approval on the total invoice amount if you wanted to. Okay. One thing, good and bad. So when I go in to code an invoice and I'm going to charge it to the GL, today, there's no limitations on the general ledger account that a user can select. Now, in one of the firms I worked with, we actually added a custom field in the chart of accounts to indicate whether it was available in workflow or not. To my knowledge, Aderant has not standardized that yet. I'd like to see them do that at some point. It's ridiculous to have cash accounts and whip accounts showing up when I'm going to charge, charge an expense to it. So I'd really like to see those accounts limited. Now, that said, you can, at the vendor level, restrict your GL accounts. Okay. Obviously, this could be very tedious because you probably have thousands of vendors, but you can go into the vendor setup and say you can only charge, this vendor, Worldwide Express, can only be charged to, this GL account. As I mentioned, you can automatically post the invoice. Now, these GL approvals are now actually configurable in Aderant, in Expert Administration. One thing I'm a little disappointed in here is that they did a really nice job with the way you assign approvers to GL accounts. It actually gives you the chart of accounts tree, and you can select whole folders. Like you may have an information technology list of accounts. You can assign that to an approver, and you can do that down to the office and department level. For whatever reason, they have not included Profit Center in that approval process yet. That's not to say that you couldn't get around that with some customizations, perhaps a custom table, but I would like to see Aderant add in the Profit Center. So I'm going to try to zip through the next couple slides because I know.
Roger, one question did come in.
Yep.
If the in the AP approval process, if it gets rejected at that point, what happens to the workflow data?
So that's something that you would have to determine as part of your implementation. If trying to remember the standard, typically if one of these is not approved, it's going to come back to the person who entered it, right? And you can put a reason in for the rejection, right? It could be, hey, you need to use a different vendor, or this is the wrong GL account. So typically it's going to loop back here for this person to correct, and then it's going to go through this process again. Let me just try to finish up. I will stay on past 3 o'clock Eastern if anyone wants to ask questions. So I already showed you this slide, but after I've gone through kind of those 3 processes, I just wanted to reiterate a couple of things. One is you've got to define that process, and 2, expect to have to do a lot of testing and validation. Okay. So to kind of wrap things up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about how Simplex can help you with workflow. We do not develop workflows. Okay. The primary developer of workflows is still Aderant. Many of you are aware that the team is in New Zealand, which can be a bit frustrating. That workflow team has grown significantly. I'm not going to say they don't have a backlog of work and that they can start on your project tomorrow, but there are some extremely competent developers doing this out of New Zealand. They've really upped their game on the workflow development. Where we can help you is with process design and the requirements gathering. As I've said, I've probably implemented 30 to 40 different workflows for firms. So we are very good at helping you narrow down this process and letting you know kind of what's going to work within a workflow, what's not, what's going to be highly customized, etc. Okay. We can also provide testing assistance, help you create documentation and your training and rollout plan, and we can help manage your workflow implementation as we go through. Also, for those of you that may be looking to upgrade, we can assist you with the upgrade from a kind of project management and consulting perspective, and we don't do the technical work. And if you would like to have a conversation about workflows, I am happy to get on the phone with you for 20 minutes, half an hour. We can go into more detail than we were able to cover here today, but you can email me. You can reply to the meeting invite that enabled you to join this meeting. Happy to share my knowledge with you on workflows, and certainly happy to get involved with your firm and help you through the project if if appropriate. So with that, Ivan, were there any more questions?
There was one early on. This is a question with regards to notifications within the workflows. Basically, just to clarify what notification options there are outside of, just the person receiving an email. And then, even within that, how customizable are those?
Right. So obviously you're aware of the email notification. The challenge with the email notification is that if you have that turned on, the users get a notification for each task that's been assigned to them. Now, if you run 200 pre-bill workflows for the attorney, they're going to kill you if they get 200 emails telling them they have these pre-bills. So other options are within EA Pro, you can see all of the tasks that you need to act upon. Okay, so if you can get your attorneys oriented towards EA Pro, and in all implementations that I've been working on, we've moved away from Expert Assistant. In fact, I have a firm that went live almost 3 years ago, and even then they did not have workflow at the time. They were able to only roll out EA Pro to the attorneys. So you can see those notifications in there. The emails are customizable, and I believe that's within Expert Admin. It's HTML. So there are some, for people like me who are technical enough to get into trouble, if you can wade through the HTML, you can make modifications, or there may be someone at your firm who knows HTML well and can build that for you. There's also, you can set reminders. So maybe the attorney wants to get a reminder every 5 days of their outstanding workflow tasks. Okay. Anything else, Ivan?
No other questions through the chat.
Okay, I'm going to stay on for 2 or 3 minutes here. If anyone wants to stick on and unmute yourself and just have a casual conversation or ask any questions, I'll stick here for a minute.
Actually, one more question just came in. What have you heard about workflow stability of these workflows?
My experience is these workflows have become extremely stable. When I first was working for clients who were implementing workflow, it was 2018, there were tons and tons of faulted workflows. When this one firm went live, I think on the first day, they entered 700 check request workflows. And unfortunately, because the workflow engine wasn't powerful enough at the time, we were just getting SQL conflicts and the workflow would fault, meaning it gets stuck. I rarely see faulted workflows that are caused by technical issues. If you've missed something in the design of your workflow, it is possible there could be a scenario where something faults because you didn't catch it in testing. Also, for those of you who are familiar with the workflows, there is an administrative tool called Workflow Admin, which enables you to see all workflows that are in process. The performance of Workflow Admin has advanced considerably. Aderant has added new filters to Workflow Admin so that you can more easily narrow down and find the actual workflow that you're looking for. Okay. Anything else?
Nothing through the chat.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for spending the time today. I'm reachable at the email. Happy to have a conversation with you about workflow and see how we can help. Hope you all learned something today and look forward to speaking with you in the future. Take care.